taking a look at it with an increased focus on the continent in light of trade and investment opportunities, what effect have you seen that pickup in the world trade dynamic have and place on ports authorities?
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on Power Lunch. I think the first thing to observe about Africa as a whole is that for a number of years, Africa had lost touch with its economic reality, that it's an island continent. 72% of African countries are either coastal or the island states. So that's the first point. And it's the second largest landmass on Earth, meaning that if you take the total population of Africa for 1 billion people, the issue of trade and the context needs to be understood in that regard. Because the trade for Africa means that 91% of African trade with other nations is seaborne, and therefore the importance of African ports. The second observation to make, perhaps, is the one that says for many, many years, Africa was entangled in conflict and wars and all of those. But for the past 15, 20 years, we've seen stabilization of Africa politically, and therefore the emergence of the coastal nations in particular as lead nodal point for African development. And therefore trade in Africa comes on the back of those nations that are mostly coastal, and therefore coastal shipping and trade.
Let's take a look then at, capabilities. How are you rating African ports' capabilities right now from a logistics point of view? Are we keeping up in terms of pace and development on that front to cater to the demand that's naturally come with this shift in dynamic?
It is the largest challenge for Africa, because if you look at our trade efficiencies, for an example, because our logistics networks are not very efficient, they're not efficient at all in actual fact. For an example, Africa has got the largest landlocked countries anywhere on any continent, which then means that the bulk of African countries are dependent for the coastal-based one for logistics access to markets. But we've got one of the most inefficient systems. So what we've seen over the last maybe 10 years now is a lot of investments into ports, a lot of investments into management of such ports in terms of terminal management. But what is still lacking is the reorganization of the logistics themselves to make them very efficient, because they're not efficient at all.
Of course, that comes with integration of your various infrastructure capacities where, for example, rail and port go hand in hand in South Africa. We've seen the headlines coming to the fore already, how if we don't get that right, that integration and the development of that infrastructure, that we may well miss the next commodity boom.
Definitely. If you look at the AU's emphasis, even NEPAD for an example, it's been on infrastructure. And there are two parts to that infrastructure. One will be energy, obviously, but the second biggest investment in Africa is to capacitate the continent, both to integrate and increase capacity. For an example, within the AU, South Africa has been given the north-south corridor to link the north to the south through railway lines. But in 2009, we signed a convention for Africa called the African Maritime Charter, which for the first time will allow Africa to integrate on the seaside and make sure that we've got a pendulum that goes up and down on the east and west of the continent.
Of course, we've been talking about infrastructure challenges in the traditional sense of infrastructure. There's also new risks that are affecting the ports and its ability to stimulate that trade and investment climate. It's the state of security infrastructure. Run us through the status on that front and actually how you handle something like that.
For quite a few years now, we've been arguing this point that what we take for granted on other continents, for an example, security and safety, are strategic issues when it comes to the African continent. Because the wastage in Africa comes out of having a continent that is not safe and secure, which means every 15, 20 years, you have to rebuild infrastructure in Africa. You look at Ivory Coast, you look at the rollout of uprisings on the north of the continent. So on the maritime side, we've been working together with the International Maritime Organization to strengthen security. As SAMSA in particular, what we've done is we've installed technologies like your long-range identification and tracking of ships capabilities. We are now into satellite technologies for tracking movements of ships out at sea. What is currently, two key security challenges, obviously, is piracy, as we've seen it, off Somali, but there's a lot of piracy on the west coast of Africa as well. And the second thing is the pillage of African resources like your fishing stocks, where because there are no coast guards, most countries in Africa don't have naval capabilities, even coast guard capabilities, which has left the continent open.
So some strides being made, still a large gap to be filled in terms of getting things going where it needs to be. When it comes to alliances that are being looked at to further boost investment within this space, PPPs are often cited primary. There's been a recommendation though for possible privatization of ports authorities being the solution and improving operational efficiency. Is that a viable solution in your books?
It's a viable one. If you look at the amount of capital that's required on the continent, without the government and private sector coming in together, it's going to be extremely difficult. For an example, we're expecting the trade boom just come out of recession maybe over the next 3-5 years. Africa may lose out on it because of the amount of capital that's needed in the short span of time, and governments do not have that much cash in their coffers. So private sector has to come in very strongly in order to increase the capacity of the continent and therefore open the continent to its alliances.